Hi everybody, welcome, Happy New Year. Welcome to the fourth session of the 2020-2021 Learning Exchange Series with the Forest Climate Working Group. I'm your host, Lauren Cooper, and I lead the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at Michigan State University. And I'm also on the steering committee of the Forest Climate Working Group. We are very pleased to lead the Learning Exchange Series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group. And if you are unfamiliar, the FCWG, as we call it, is a diverse group of forest interests with over 60 members, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. The group has worked together for more than a decade to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. Here you can see our full speaker lineup. If there are sessions that you've missed, please know that they are recorded and available on our website, and please look ahead and sign up for any upcoming sessions so that you get them on your calendar and get reminders for those sessions. For today, I'd like to introduce David Ware, a non-resident senior fellow at Resources for the Future, and Francisco Aguilar, professor at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Today's session will focus on assessing the forest industry from the procurement of fibers to the manufacturing and utilization of final products. And this has a major role in forest carbon dynamics. David and Francisco will examine the carbon dynamics associated with forest carbon markets and then discuss ongoing assessment of carbon pools within procurement landscapes, including in the expanding US wood pellet industry. But before we get them started, a couple of housekeeping details. For one, if you'd like to receive updates about any upcoming webinars, any information about this series and other engagement opportunities, please email forestc@msu.edu to join our email list. Attendees today are qualified to receive 1 CFE credit from SAF, Society of American Foresters. So if this is relevant to you, we're happy to make sure that you get your credit. This is automatically communicated to SAF if you've registered with your SAF account, your email address. But if you have questions about this, please reach out to us at forestc@msu.edu. Your attendees today are also qualified to receive 1 CEU credit from ISA. And so if you'd like to receive ISA credits, please reach out to us at forestc@msu.edu and we will share the event code with you so that you can get credit. The session is being recorded and will be posted to the web on our website, along with any supplemental materials, including PDFs of the presentation slides within a week or so. So if you've registered, you'll get an email letting you know when this happens and where to find the materials. And this session will be followed by a Q&A. So on the Zoom interface, you'll see the word chat. We're all very familiar with Zoom at this point, but there's a little drop-down triangle next to it. You can put your questions in at any point. So we strongly encourage you, don't hold your questions to the end because you might forget some important clarifications that others could benefit from as well. So feel free to put in any questions at any point. We keep an eye on these throughout the presentations, and we do 1 Q&A session at the end. And so again, feel free to put your questions at any point. If you're calling in by phone and you're just joining audio, but you have access to email, you can also send any questions directly to forestc@msu.edu and we will get them on our list. We do have a lot of folks here today, so in case of outstanding questions, which we are always have at this point, we will follow up with our speakers and with a Word document and ask them to generously answer additional questions, and we'll post their responses in a PDF along with the recording materials. And so I'll be back for a Q&A, but with that, I look forward to the presentations today. David will be speaking first, so David, will you please share your screen and begin today's presentation?
Well, through all of those mouse clicks, I hope I now have my screen at the right setting.
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for the opportunity to present to this group. I look forward to not only hearing your response, but also to hearing Francisco's presentation following mine. I'll be giving a fairly broad perspective on the interaction of wood products markets and forest products markets with forest carbon sequestration in the United States. And then Francisco will focus in on some much more detailed analysis of some of these same issues. This presentation is largely focused on one part of a really big question I think that we're facing now as we anticipate different mechanisms for expanding the forest carbon sink as a means to provide the U.S. and the world with substantial climate benefits. In other words, how can we begin to encourage the expansion of a forest carbon sink in the United States using a variety of different policy instruments and begin to look at a comparison of various policy instruments for affecting that change. Today, I'm going to look especially at the potential role of wood products markets in accomplishing this objective, something that maybe gets not as much attention as things like afforestation incentives and other direct initiatives to expand the forest estate. But before I get started on that, I think I'll preach to the choir just a little bit. It's clear to me that forests provide an important and a consequential climate benefit already in the United States. We likely all know that forests are especially good at capturing atmospheric carbon through photosynthesis, but at the same time, forests emit carbon through respiration, decay, combustion, and wildfire, and the like. So we look at forest carbon in the United States over the last 30 years, where we have detailed data. It's clear that capture has exceeded emissions for these several decades, and that forest carbon is a growing asset, that it has been expanding at roughly about half of a percent per year from 1990 through 2017. And if we look at the forest carbon inventory of the US, it basically stores about 52 years of US greenhouse gas emissions at our current levels. It's a vast and critical stock of carbon that commands our attention, both to protect and stabilize that inventory, but also to continue to expand it using various policy mechanisms. So here's a quick overview of how forests provide a sink for atmospheric carbon. Forests, as I mentioned, capture carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, the PS in this diagram, and lose it through emissions, either directly to the atmosphere in the form of wildfire or through harvesting. Harvested forest biomass can then store carbon in wood products in a built environment, and eventually in landfills or other waste systems. And that storage can extend forest carbon storage for up to 100 or 200 years in various uses. And so while forest carbon alone can max out, in other words, forests can reach a maximum carbon sink over time, product pools provide a mechanism for building an ancillary carbon sink that can enhance the overall carbon storage in the US. I've paired this description of carbon sinks with a description of land uses in the orange boxes here, because forest carbon is determined not only by the dynamics of forest growth and emissions and transfer to different product pools, but is scaled by the amount of forests that are on the landscape. And these in turn are changed over time through a series of land use transitions that affect the total scale and potential for forest carbon storage. Now we can look at the history of carbon sequestration, and then I'm sure many of you have over the last 30 years. And the graph on the left shows forest carbon sequestration in the United States between 1990 and 2018. I apologize, the y-axis doesn't have a label, but that's million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. That is the carbon that is pulled out of the atmosphere on an annual basis by these carbon pools. The blue area shows the forest ecosystem carbon, that first blue ball, if you will, and shows that forest ecosystem carbon has amounted to about 600 million metric tons of negative emissions for the United States over this period. At the same time, the product pool, which is the orange bar, has accounted for about 30 to 50 million metric tons of carbon storage or sequestration over that time period. And expansion in the solid waste disposal system, SWDS, has been a steady source of additional carbon storage moving forward. Now, if we look at the orange bar, especially in that left-hand side, and look at how its magnitude has changed over time, can see that in 2008, 2009, it basically shrank not only to zero, but it went negative in that the forest product pool did not expand through the Great Recession with the big downturn in housing starts, but it has recovered since then. So if we look at the right-hand side, you can see the green line is the carbon sequestered in the forest building pool or forest products in use. The dark blue line is the carbon sequestered in the solid waste disposal system. That's the increase in that pool over time. And then I've thrown in the light blue line, which shows housing starts in the US. And it shows that products in use are largely determined by housing starts and product demand, which should be fairly obvious. But another thing to point out as we look at this is that the overall trend in carbon stored in products has been down over time, so that the relationship between housing starts and product consumption has diminished over this historical period. You can look also at the historical change in land uses, again, with forest land use ultimately determining the scale of the forest carbon pool in the United States. And on the left-hand side, we have private lands, and I should point out that we're holding federal lands. We have federal land marked here, but all of the land uses are for private lands, and shows the change in land use over time. And one thing to point out here is that changes in overall or net change in land use has been fairly gradual between the 1980s and 2012 in this particular graph. These very gradual changes in total land use do show some important overall dynamics. And I think the most stunning to me is the decline in agricultural land in the United States, a very substantial decline of many millions of acres. At the same time, the developed land use in the United States has grown nearly doubled over that time period. But other land uses, including forests, have been relatively stable. In fact, we've seen a gradual increase in forest area in the United States over this time period. And rangeland has seen some decline, but a stabilization in the last couple of decades. However, this almost glacial movement in net land use change is a bit deceptive. If we look at the right-hand chart here, where I've plotted out transitions in land use among all of the different land use types, in effect, looking at those arrows in that initial flow chart, you see there's been some substantial shifts among land uses. The most substantial one is the movement from agricultural land use to forest land use. Between 1982 and 2012, that's roughly 30 million acres that shifted from agricultural uses to forest uses. That's followed by roughly 24 million acres moving from agricultural land to CRP land. And then if we look at land use moving to urban, there's roughly 17 to 18 million acres of forest that's moved to an urban use, and 17 to 18 million acres of agricultural land that has moved to an urban use over this time period. In other words, the gross changes, the transitions among uses are really substantial in spite of the very slow shift in net change. That means that in spite of the totals being relatively stable, the underlying land areas are actually quite dynamic. Would point out that the shift from ag to forest has more than fully offset the shift from forest to urban uses, allowing for that slight change in, that slight increase in forest land between the 80s and in current time. Oops. We can look at those data in a slightly different way and look at how forest land use has changed over this time period, looking at inflows and outflows of forest land. And in other words, simplifying that fairly complex chart that I showed earlier. If we look just at the land that's moving into forest and the land that's moving out of forest and the total change in forest land over time, we see that at a peak in the 1990s, we had as much as 2 million acres of land, agricultural land, moving into forest every year. At the same time, we were seeing as much as 1.7 million acres per year moving out of forest and into some other use, largely urban, but also back to ag. Over time, this increase in forest land has been declining to the point where we're roughly stable over the last two time periods, a slight dip to negative and a slight positive in the most recent years. It's clear that land use has tightened up, and as we've studied the mechanisms behind this change, this land use dynamic has been largely influenced by relative prices of ag products and timber products. And so that as timber product prices stabilized or even declined in the 2000s, the flow into forest was diminished substantially as a result. If we look at the right-hand side, we see where these changes in forest land uses occurred. And the most substantial increases in forest land, that's the green areas in that map, are to be found in the Southeast, and especially the South Central, Mississippi, Alabama, and East Texas, where timber markets encouraged substantial investment and afforestation driven by these forest product markets. So, I've mashed up a description of forest carbon dynamics with a description of land use dynamics because I think they ultimately determine this outcome of interest, which is the amount of carbon sequestered in the nation. And so how could we go about expanding the sink, understanding these mechanisms? It seems to me that there's 5 different ways to do it. And it has to do with affecting the flows that are shown in this diagram. Number 1 is to reduce forest losses to urban uses. So we've looked at some of the projections of forest carbon over time. It's clear that urbanization is driving an awful lot of carbon dynamics in the wrong direction. Number 2 is shifting more rural land to forest uses or cover. And so 2A and 2B are the shifts from ag to forest and forest to ag, respectively. And as we saw in those previous diagrams, it's a very substantial dynamic involving switching in historical time over the last 4 decades of roughly 40 to 50 million acres moving in one direction or the other. Relative prices of forest and ag products can have an influence on that dynamic and the net change in forest area. The third mechanism is to expand the ancillary storage of carbon, of forest carbon or forest ecosystem carbon in the form of products and in that product slash a solid waste system. And then four, simply increase growth. I think I have my numbers reversed here. Number 5 in the chart is actually number 4 in the list, where we increase the growth, and that can happen by specific management actions seeking to expand the area of or the amount of carbon contained within forests, and then finally reduce emissions from the forest ecosystem carbon pool, which could likely come in the form of reducing wildfire emissions. So getting into a little bit more detail with regard to expanding the sink, I've described a set of physical mechanisms. So this list, 1 to 5 is the same as the previous chart. Basically, these are how the carbon pool can be expanded over time. They can only be implemented, at least on the private landscape, through a set of economic activities. So the economic mechanism that can lead to these physical mechanisms is land use choices. So land use switching, and that is either through land use switching from forestry to an urban use, or switching other rural land uses to a forest use. And we've seen that markets in the past have driven land toward forest. And economics can continue that or reverse that. And then there's forest management choices that are relative to returns to management. So to the extent that management that increases carbon can provide additional returns, we would expect that a market would drive that outcome. And then finally, the third layer of this discussion is the policy instrument that can actually encourage the choices that I've listed here in the economic mechanism box. And so the policy instruments are carbon pricing and markets, and we've heard an awful lot about that, and we'll continue to hear about that. Subsidies and incentive payments that can encourage afforestation, in effect changing the returns to a land use choice or changing the returns to a forest management choice. Some kind of preferential tax treatment. And then finally, regulatory changes. And I think this is where wood products considerations come in. To the extent that regulatory changes can encourage the use of wood products in for example, tall buildings or the like, we can see an increase in the return to land use, forest land use, and return to specific forest management activities. And we shouldn't talk about regulatory changes in the land use context without thinking about ag policies. In other words, existing and potential new policies that could change the relative returns to agriculture and therefore change the relative preference for forest or agriculture moving forward. So wood products markets can have important effects on forest carbon outcomes. There are some direct effects, and we looked at those in the blue balls, if you will, in transferring forest carbon to long-term storage in wood product pools. By harvesting forest to transfer carbon to those pools, we also reset the forest age of the existing forests, and that allows for a rapid regrowth so that the rate of sequestration on forest land increases in response to a reset of the forest age. There's also land use effects. Increasing returns to forestry leads to a dampening of the switching from forest to other uses, and especially from forest to urban uses. And as we've seen in the southeastern United States, increases in returns to forestry lead to investment-driven afforestation and reforestation activities. And beyond that, we can also look at other effects that would allow for supporting fuel treatment harvest on both public and private lands in the United States, with some eventual impact on wildfire emissions if done at the appropriate scale. Looking forward, just think a little bit more about where we stand with respect to the carbon sink in the United States. We look at our baseline projections. This is taken from the 2015 RPA assessment update. We expect a gradual increase in some of the wood products carbon pools moving forward. Very gradual. The products in use tends to stabilize at a level at about that we saw in 2000, with a gradual increase in the solid waste or landfill carbon. But at the same time, we see forest carbon, and I want you to ignore the red line here. Look at the green line, which is what we expect in terms of forest carbon sequestration moving to the year 2060. And the important takeaway here is that we expect an ongoing decline in the amount of carbon that's sequestered in U.S. forests based on a projection of a business as usual kind of scenario. If we add the forest sequestration to the wood product sequestration I showed in the previous slide, you show that the rate of decline for the total sector is diminished after we account for the wood products carbon. Another point to be made here is that as we move forward, as forest sequestration declines in response to the aging of forest more than anything, but also increased emissions, that wood products carbon is going to play a more important role in terms of the share of total carbon sequestration, so that we move from about 20% of forest carbon in most recent data to expecting that in the future, products will amount to about 33% or a third of total sequestration in the forest sector. I think I'll skim over this. My time is growing short, but our scenario analysis of looking at how markets might shift this carbon sequestration is, we've shown that if wood products markets increased or demand increased, we could encourage an afforestation of roughly 15 million acres. And that would be enough to stabilize ecosystem carbon sequestration at levels that we're currently seeing, rather than that would fully offset the decline that we are seeing in our baseline projections. So just conclude by saying that, based on an analysis of the various natural climate solutions that are out there, afforestation is clearly provides the greatest increase in forest carbon over time. Again, not a new finding, but that afforestation can be encouraged in different ways. And forest products markets have encouraged afforestation over the past 30 years in response to strong prices. And this can continue in the future. And policies that would shift demand outward could have that effect moving forward. Expansion in wood products demand has multiple effects, as we've mentioned. Get the increased storage in these ancillary pools, and we see shifts in land use toward forest use is driven exclusively by market dynamics. So I'll conclude there and turn it over to Francisco.
Thank you, Dave. It's always good to share the screen with you today. And I'm assuming everyone can hear me well. Only I guess I'll hear otherwise through the chat box. But I will focus a little more on the regional scale assessment of wood energy markets, specifically the procurement of wood to manufacture wood pellets in the US South and in the US North for the entire US Eastern region of the country. This is, before I start, and thanks again for the opportunity, Lauren, to join the group today. I want to start acknowledging the financiers for this research, starting with the US Department of Agriculture, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and also the McIntyre Stennis program. Much of the work on the computing heavy lifting took place at the is taking place at the University of Missouri Computing Support Services System, which is a part of the infrastructure funded by the National Science Foundation. So wood energy and preaching to the choir, and it's something that I always like to set the stage with. And in this regard, wood energy entails the utilization of wood and wood materials to generate energy. And I emphasized, and I have italicized here, the fact that it can be a renewable energy source and it can reduce net carbon emissions. It's not a categorical yes, no, it depends, it can. And it's a function of a number of issues, a number of factors. The supply chain, where the material is procured from, how it is processed, the conversion from fibers into useful energy. What are the alternative energy sources that one has if one were not to use wood or complement it or have another source of energy? How it compares to that alternative. And of course, there are issues of space and time. When looking at energy and looking at forests specifically and how they grow and regrow and the materials that are turned into energy, that issue is very critical, space and time. But the very first one, the very first step is that of procurement, is how that land, how conditions within the land from which wood is procured from to generate energy has changed. And that's a big focus on the for my talk today. For additional information regarding other aspects of wood energy, we released a publication last year, so I posted the link to this as well. It expands on issues beyond carbon, also including ecological issues and socioeconomic, even cultural issues associated with energy. So wood pellets, that would be the focus for my talk today, the wood pellet industry in the US East. Why? Here on the screen, I plotted the imports by the EU 28, so this includes the United Kingdom, of wood pellets from outside the EU. There's a share amount of trading within the EU, but much of it, about 50%, comes from sources other than the European Union. And the US has become the #1 trade partner when it comes to wood pellets with the EU. It wasn't the case back in 2012. Canada was the #1 source of wood pellets at the time. But since then, capacity has grown much in the US, specifically in the southeastern coastal US. And it remains, the US has become and is expected to continue to be the #1 source of wood pellets for industrial purposes from outside the EU. And I say industrial purposes because most, if not all of these pellets are utilized to generate electricity. Primarily 75% these days imported by the United Kingdom, much of the rest imported by the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, and others. But most of it, if not of all of these pellets, are utilized for industrial purposes. And again, keeping things into perspective, this is a very important sector. It's growing relatively fast, if not very fast. But let's put it in context with other products. And this is data from the US South. So for those of you familiar with the region, you know what it entails within the Forest Service definition. But for those of you who might not, it includes the southeast corner from Oklahoma, Texas, down to Florida, up to Virginia. And within the region, the wood pellet industry has grown. as you can expect, from 1.8 million green short tons back in 2011 to over 6.5 by 2017. It's good to look at heat. It's a relatively small share compared to other products. Nonetheless, it's a growing one. And in many cases, will likely come into as an alternative product use or product as an industry to other industry sectors. Like in this case, in your screen, you can see the pulpwood sector has remained relatively flat over this period. There's been a major growth in terms of sawlogs, but a little bit of decline in terms of composite panel production. So the wood pellet industry has come in and perhaps fill a little bit of a void in some of the closure, on some of the contraction in other parts of the wood forest industry. So back to the study, and this is what we did. Our aim is to offer a systematic assessment. Up to this point, the effect or the impacts of the wood pellet industry in the US and the US Southeast specifically has been much of it based on case studies. So an assessment that is systematic allows to really look at the signals that can happen over a relatively good period of time as we have here. And of course, the challenge that we have is that once one engaged in a systematic assessment, one is not making a specific evaluation of a facility. Rather, things are extended to the sample included in our study. This is an ex post, it's not an ex ante projection. So actually, we're looking back in time and seeing how conditions within timberlands in the procurement landscapes of wood pellet mills have changed over time. And in that sense, the general contribution of this work is that of offering a framework so that we can look at a number of different attributes and how they have changed within the procurement areas and landscapes of the industry at the time. So within the general sense, this is the contribution we try to make. Most of the data when it comes to the forest attributes, specifically within timberlands, and we limited it to timberlands so that we avoid including lands under conservation. We look at landscapes. Again, we don't want to look at a specific plot or a specific stand at this point. We want to look at the landscapes. And we distinguish between the landscapes of large-scale pellet mills, so those with over 1,000 metric tons of capacity per year, and a smaller landscape for those of a smaller capacity. And the reason for that is because of the footprint is much smaller, and given the capacity that manufacturing requires, also the procurement distances are greater. So that tries to tease out that fact that they have different landscapes and the different procurement sizes of the landscapes. In terms of the attributes that we looked into, we look at a specific number of trees. This comes directly derived from inventory data plots. So this is the number of live trees, number of growing stock trees, and standing dead trees. They aim to capture a number of indicators, including those used for commercial purposes, like growing stocks over a live number of trees for conditions, and also standing dead trees for ecological purposes. And for carbon pools, we look at carbon pools within live trees and standing dead trees. This includes above and below ground carbon. And for soils, we also include that as estimated from the FIA database. And this is tied to forest conditions within those timberlands. We looked back in time between the year 2005 and 2017. And we have a 3-year moving window where we sample any point, any procurement landscape as previously defined, where at any point during this period there was a wood pellet mill. And we distinguish between the coastal southeast and the rest of the east as a way to distinguish any differences, any discernible differences between the two. Why we look into the coastal southeast? Because that's where all the wood pellets exported to the EU go to. So we try to tease out the effect of the new demand, the new demand from Europe for these wood pellets. And we also control for a number of other issues. In fact, we learned that some of them are a lot more important than the industry presence, like population, which I think Dave highlighted already, and other things that are completely non-human, like severe weather. So we also control for the presence of extreme drought within procurement landscapes too over this period. So our study area is the Eastern United States. Overall, we look at 123 landscapes at any point where they had a wood pellet mill over this time period. And overall, this used data from about 38,000 inventory plots. With the focus today is looking at the effects on the U.S. within the U.S. coastal southeast and the effects of large-scale pellet mills, again over 100,000 tons of capacity, and that being the case because of the economies of scale necessary to reach international markets. So looking at both, it helps find out what have been the associated effects with large-scale mills within the U.S. coastal southeast. Let's see what we find. And some of that, for those of you who have a greater interest in the topic or specifically in the methods that we use in this analysis, which was a panel regression of controlling for a number of fixed and random effects, and especially autoregressive conditions, there's a link available, and it's a publicly available paper under scientific report. So you're welcome to take a look at it. So what we found? The first condition that I mentioned was any associated effects with the U.S. coastal southeast. So that regional effect, how was it associated with the number of attributes that we had included in our assessment? And here I have only included those that were statistically significant. So overall, the negative signs show that there were fewer number of live trees, fewer number of growing stock trees within a procurement area. Is that a bad thing? No, it's not a bad thing, most likely because we didn't see any changes, in fact, in carbon levels. That means that just the same amount of carbon is found within fewer trees in these cases. So probably an indication of management. On the last column, I have included area adjusted numbers, and this is just as a point of reference. The study was conducted at the procurement landscape level. So I will not dwell too much into per hectare numbers because these are just for reference, but this is a good indication in terms of the effect. Very little effect. If one were to do this at a smaller scale, it will be very hard to detect statistically any signal. So at landscape level allows to look at what are the likely associated effects of the industry and the operation of the industry. There was a signal of lower carbon levels within soils, and this translates into also an annual effect. It's relatively small when it comes at a hectare level, so it's only a fraction of what it will be in carbon soils within a given stand in the region. And of course, it comes with the caveat that carbon stocks are calculated based on inventory and other variables. But nonetheless, there was a negative signal that's worth keeping an eye on. And for the other variable that we control in the panel model that captures some of the effects associated with large-scale wood pellet manufacturing, we found that there were more carbon in live trees. So most likely, there is that market signal that Dave mentioned, the market signal that there is a new procurement for mills to be utilized into pellet for pelletization. So that signal is probably translating into that greater amount of carbon in live trees. We also found a fewer number of standing dead trees. This is something that others have found for specific case studies. So we found that systematic effect. And is that a bad thing? No, probably not, given the time scale that we're looking into. But nonetheless, we are also it can have a positive effect if it helps reduce wildfire and other things. So I will scroll quickly over this. This is additional compounded effects of greater quote-unquote competition. So what we found is these procurement landscapes overlap more with one another, then we found that there were a greater number of growing stock trees over that increase in competition for pellet fibers, pelletization fibers, and some more carbon life trees and others. So some of the insights that we have, yes, markets work. And so there is an incentive to regrow those trees. Most likely that's what the signal that we found. The fewer number of standing dead trees, again, it's something very important to keep an eye on, specifically for ecological reasons, for habitat purposes and nutrient cycling, but it can also help cope with wildfires. And if these become more prevalent over time, then that could be a good thing too. So it could be either way. And less carbon in soils, it could be a reflection of intensification, but it's something that deserves more work, and in fact, it's something that we are looking into. So in terms of trends, what we have seen over this time, and it goes back to carbon. Over time, we have seen less and less fibers that were previously used for as residue. Less of an amount of residues are now manufactured into wood pellets. So more materials coming directly from the field. On the positive side of residues, well, if one were to use only residues, well, they have little additionality. There's no extra carbon. Residue was going to be unutilized and the carbon was going to be emitted anyway. But when it comes to fibers, it can go either way. The good thing that we have found in this analysis, nonetheless, is that when utilizing that fiber coming from timberlands, there was a signal of a positive effect. So this is a relatively short period of time in terms of monitoring and assessment. It's very critical to look at other variables that affect procurement landscapes. Population change is the most important driver, in fact, and extreme weather, it's something that it's very critical too. So looking at those effects and compounded with other policies, including domestic policies in the US, is good to keep an eye on. Just a shout out for work in progress that we're looking into actual inventory data, and specifically for the coastal Southeast. And we are expanding our study of carbon to that of ecological indicators like species richness and biodiversity, and also further looking into soil carbon issues as well. So I want to highlight my contributors, and I know we just ran out of time, so I will stop right here, and any questions, I'll be happy to take them along with Dave. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Francisco and David. Really wonderful presentations, very insightful, and we have lots of questions. And so we have about 10 minutes. We'll get to a couple of them today, and then we'll have to follow up with some additional correspondences by email. A couple of clarifications. I have one for David here. One, when you are defining afforestation or afforestation, how are you defining that compared to reforestation? So when you're looking at like the possibility or the potential for afforestation, for example, were those forest lands at some point in the past, or how is that being defined in your work?
Well, Lauren, I know that this can be a sticking point for some. So basically what I was calling afforestation is the planting of a land use that was not forest in the previous period. So at some point in the past, it could have been forest, but this is an act of switching from one land use to forest land use.
And another quick follow-up for you as well, David. When you're referring to forest conversion to urban use, is that also including like suburban and exurban development, or is that more densely urban development that you're referring to?
It's the broader definition. So it includes any kind of urban, suburban developed use.
Great, thank you. And a question for both of you, maybe to respond to. You know, we're talking about carbon here today, but we recognize that we have a wide range of values that we have with forest and forested lands. Can you speak to just a little bit about maybe how other co-benefits or other values for forests are fitting into your analyses? For example, wildlife habitat and other ecosystem services, and just how do you fold that into your work, and was that involved in your analysis specifically, Francisco?
So one indicator for that was the number of standing dead trees. I mean, that's important for wildlife habitat purposes, but it's not enough. It's just a very rough indicator. We're looking into actual forest inventory data plots and we're looking at species richness and as another indicator beyond just carbon. I think ecological values are extremely important.
And I'd add that any analysis of wildlife is context dependent and requires variable scales. So we know that there are imperiled amphibians in the lower coastal flatwoods, and that requires analysis at a specific scale. And so it's far beyond the carbon analysis per se, but we can look at these inventory data and see that in spite of increased production in many areas, we're seeing an increase in the average diameter of trees, even for softwoods. That's suggesting an increasing specialization. So more production coming from planted forests that are intensively managed, and then maybe less production coming from non-plantation forests. So that, again, trees are getting bigger across nearly all forest types.
Great, thank you for those responses. We certainly have some interest here in the types of material that might be going into pellets or for energy production. So I think this, David, you may be able to speak to this as well, but this might be more for Francisco. Like, for example, you mentioned residues would be a non-carbon additive source of energy, since the carbon would be emitted through decomposition anyways. Could you unpack that a little more? We had a couple of questions about that. Like, where are you seeing residues being used? What do you think is the potential for additional residue use? And do you see residues maybe not being used enough, or seeing that as like a potential for market growth? Just thought you could maybe comment a little more on that for us.
Yeah, so when the industry was relatively small, the main source of feedstock was residues. But as you grow larger and you reach economies of scale, or you try to reach economies of scale with large manufacturing, you cannot solely rely on residues anymore. So perhaps for those interested, the best source of data that I know of, you can Google EIA, densified wood energy survey within the Energy Information Agency, EIA. And then you have monthly reports based on survey of these facilities and seeing how the composition of those materials.
So we have, and so relatedly, we had a couple of questions about markets. So one was about the northern U.S. and maybe, for example, specifically the Midwest, that has had declines in paper manufacturing. So do you see potential for forest markets utilizing this wood that would have traditionally gone into those markets, maybe transitioning to other purposes like energy production?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. But keep an eye on, scale. And that's why I actually showed the graphs for the US South. I mean, wood energy can help fill a void, but it will not replace it altogether. I mean, the demand that a paper mill has, it cannot be just matched by a pellet mill. So there's opportunity. And I think, like, for instance, just to throw a number, we were looking, we also, in a different analysis, we looked at the value added of utilizing wood-based energy over carbon, and you create locally based value added of over 20% alone. And the number of jobs that are supported by utilizing wood energy over other fossil-based sources is much, much greater. So I see a number of positives as well. Not saying it's in the Midwest, I think there's an opportunity for growth, but again, somewhat limited given scale.
And a question for, I guess for either of you, maybe more for David. I know that there can be trade-offs as far as tree age and sequestration rates and above ground storage. Can you speak a little bit about those trade-offs, and that there is an emphasis that younger trees can have those higher sequestration rates, but lots of evidence that trees will continue to sequester at high rates for a large part of their lives. But how do we think about that as a landscape scale, kind of balancing the multiple products that we do also value as society, as well as a healthy and robust forest?
That's a big question. I in many ways, the carbon benefits that we're enjoying from forests right now, this offsetting of emissions, is a result of a history of land use. In other words, the reforestation of a large part of the landscape from the 1900s, so that we've enjoyed the benefits of sequestering carbon that perhaps was lost by harvesting and land clearing centuries ago. So what we're seeing in terms of age dynamics is playing out in carbon sequestration as we see that decline in sequestration over time and projected to continue into the future. So the bottom line is that forests do eventually reach some kind of maximum capacity, some asymptote in terms of carbon storage, and that products provide us a way to sort of take some of that carbon, and put it into another storage bin, if you will, and allow the forest then to repopulate the carbon that had been harvested. So clearly there is a trade-off, and the trade-offs extend not only within the forest sector, but across sectors. So ultimately the landscape, the optimal landscape for the United States will have to take into account demand for food as well as demand for shelter. But within that space, there is room to shift land toward forest uses and more carbon sequestration as a result.
Thanks. That was actually a really nice answer. Touched on a lot of important points there. So we are kind of right on the hour. I thought maybe I could ask one kind of bigger picture question. So obviously using wood for energy does release carbon, but where we're seeing potential benefits is when we think about substitution, right, for fossil fuel use. Just thought maybe could you both speak to where you're sensing the opportunity and maybe the direction of substitution of wood-based energy, and where do you see that going as being part of a climate solution, and as far as both opportunities and maybe current challenges?
I see great opportunities when it comes to efficiency. Just efficiencies alone in residential use can do a great benefit. And as I understand it, in the latest piece of legislation under the recovery for COVID, there is some, in fact, policy tools in place to promote efficiency and offer incentives to achieve that. So I think efficiency is one of them. And good management. I think good management, there's still plenty of room to maximize the amount of carbon that one can keep in forests. In Sweden, in fact, going back a little bit to your previous question, Lauren, but we are trying to answer that question is, we have one of the most intensively managed forests in the world, and there are very little old growth left. So as a society, what do we want? Where's the balance that we want? And if we want less management, where is that wood going to come from? From somewhere in another country or another part of the world. So I think there are efficiencies of also looking at the global scale. Climate change is not an issue that one country is going to fix, but we have to fix globally.
I guess I'd add as well that there's an emission story to tell with wood products. And I don't think we have all the information we need to tell it. That, as we substitute wood for other products, there are emission savings in the production of those products. And that should be a part of the dialogue. And it's a place where we need some additional science.
Great. It's a great point to end it on. Lots of great work here that you've shared with us. Thank you very much, and additional questions for going forward. So to wrap up today, I guess a very warm thank you to both Francisco and David for your time in preparing your presentations and sharing information with us today. Thanks in advance for your time in taking a look at some of these follow-up questions that we will send to you. Big thank you to the Forest Climate Working Group for the support for the whole series, and to the steering committee for the support on the guidance for the series. And again, just a quick reminder, this is recorded. It will be on the website soon, and you're welcome to access any of the previous recordings as well. So with that, thanks again to everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Thanks again to our speakers. Take care. We'll see you in about a month.